Bright Ideas from the Green Chair spotlight Central Wisconsin and the breakthroughs, innovations, and inspirations that make our state a very special place. This program is dedicated to Bob Williams, a lifelong Central Wisconsin resident. From his public relations office in Stevens Point, Bob's bright ideas moved across the geographic, ethnic, economic, cultural, and political landscapes. His genius helped to elect a governor, build businesses, grow medical research, improve patient care, nurture a university, guard the environment, and inspire many to achieve their fullest potential. Like the fast-moving rivers of central Wisconsin, Bob Williams was uninhibited in his presentation of ideas, large and small. This despite a lifelong battle with debilitating polio that, while limiting his physical abilities, never diminished his will to move Wisconsin ever forward. From a well-worn green leather chair in Bob's office, Wisconsin Innovation was created in partnership with some of the state's most respected leaders in politics, business, education, and healthcare. Prior to his passing, Bob gave his storied green chair to longtime friend, business leader, and philanthropist John Noel. Residing now in John's home office along the Wisconsin River just outside of Stevens Point, the green chair welcomes yet another generation of bright ideas, high ideals, and strong spirit. Hello, I'm John Lobbs for another edition of WisconsinEye's Bright Ideas from the Green Chair, from the home of John and Patty Noel in Plover, Wisconsin, a show which spotlights the brightest ideas in central Wisconsin and its people. Will Hsu, the president of Ginseng Enterprises in Marathon County, is our special guest for today's edition. Welcome, Will.
Thank you.
For those of you who know of Wisconsin's position in the agricultural world, you know that we're the number one state in cheese production. We're the number one state in cranberry production. But few know that we are the number one state in the country in the production of ginseng. And it's all right here, most of it, in Marathon County, Wisconsin. So, Will, tell us something about yourself. You're second generation at Hsu Ginseng Enterprises.
Yep, that's right. My dad immigrated to the United States, moved to Wisconsin in the early 1970s, and then founded his business. He was originally a social worker and founded his business here in central Wisconsin, really starting to retail and sell ginseng, broker ginseng, export ginseng, and then started the business in Wausau. So he moved to Wausau in 1976. And we've been in central Wisconsin now for over 40 years. So I grew up working on the family farm, grew up in the ginseng industry, worked on the farm, worked at the office, went to high school in Wausau, went to UW-Madison for my undergraduate, and then moved back from the food industry about 7 or 8 years ago to take over the business and really look at how ginseng is going to change, kind of make sure that the Wisconsin ginseng industry is still as prominent in the future.
Give us a basic education on ginseng. What is it, and what is its place in Chinese culture?
So ginseng has been used traditionally in China for 2,000 or 3,000 years. Some of the earliest ginseng consumption was by the first few emperors in China. The earliest records go back to about the Han Dynasty, so that would be right around 200-300 AD, where they have written records of ginseng. That's the Asian ginseng species. Asian ginseng differs a little bit from American ginseng. The belief is that when the world was kind of one continent, before the continents drifted apart, it was the same species, but then the species evolved differently over thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands, millions of years. So Asian ginseng is more heating, it's more stimulating. It's used a lot as to help with blood flow and circulation. American ginseng is actually the exact opposite. So if you're familiar with yin and yang, the Chinese symbol. Asian ginseng is yang, hot, fiery. American ginseng is yin, cooling, tonifying. And so those two balance each other out. But Chinese have used American ginseng since about the early 1700s when it was discovered in Canada. So about 300 years ago, a French Jesuit missionary discovered American ginseng after the Jesuits had been studying traditional Chinese medicine in China, and figured that these two species were related and started exporting wild American ginseng from Canada and the colonies to China and trading it for silver, tea, porcelain, those types of things.
So what is it used for? Is it medicinal, a food supplement?
Yeah, in China, it's been the heating. The Asian species is used in winter primarily to kind of improve circulation. The American species is used more in southern China, and it's used to help tonify the body. It's used for energy, stamina, help to boost the immune system. There's a lot of research in Asia and now coming out in the United States and Europe showing how ginseng can help with just kind of whole body systems. Everything from the immune system, managing blood sugar, helping you rest better at night. A lot of this is being done because we believe in holistic medicine and treating the whole body rather than, kind of more targeted medical regimens. And so it's just a difference in philosophy and how medicine has evolved in Asia versus in the West.
Well, can you talk some about those medical studies? A little bit of internet research tells me that ginseng can be used to ease fatigue in cancer patients, to reduce blood sugar for diabetics, even to ward off the common cold. That's some of the research. Can you talk about that?
So that's really replicating research and anecdotal evidence from China and Asia, where they've been researching it for much longer. In the US, there have been some double-blind studies showing how ginseng can help alleviate fatigue symptoms from people who are undergoing cancer treatment, radiation, chemotherapy. Those tend to have a side effect of just being the patient being tired. And so when they've used higher doses of ginseng with those patients, they report less fatigue. Subjectively, they also show that they just have more energy. And so what we believe as people who consume ginseng and as people who've used ginseng for hundreds of years is that ginseng helps the body kind of balance itself out but also repair itself. And so part of the feeling of tiredness comes from not getting enough sleep, comes from the stress that you put on your body every day. In this case is an external stress, cancer treatment. And when you can find a product like ginseng which helps your body adapt to that stress, you find yourself feeling more normal or more energetic. With Americans, we tend to lead really hectic lifestyles. So what do? We wake up in the morning, we have a cup of coffee or 2 cups of coffee or an energy drink, and then we start crashing by midday, blood sugars, what have you. And we consume candy bars, we consume another energy drink, we consume, a energy shot, and we kind of go on this upper cycle. And then by the end of the day, we're so stressed out, we come home, what do? We have a glass of wine with dinner, we have a beer, we have a mixed drink, and that's a depressant. And so we go on this up-down cycle throughout the day. Southern Chinese and Chinese people in particular, we drink tea all day long. And so you'd have a cup of tea, every couple hours, and you drink it regularly. Ginseng tea, herbal teas, normal loose leaf teas, and they drink that all day long. They don't do this up-down cycle. So, there's a lot of antioxidants. There's a lot of research on tea as well. And so combining ginseng tea and some of these herbal products into your daily regimen tends to balance out your body rather than these kind of up-down swings that we tend to get on.
Let's focus on Marathon County. I said at the beginning that Wisconsin is #1 in ginseng production in the United States. I said most of it is grown here. In fact, it's about 95% of all ginseng in the country is grown within 25 miles of Wausau. Let's focus first on the history and then why. Tell us about the history of ginseng in Marathon County.
So ginseng has been traded with furs, as I mentioned earlier, for hundreds of years. But in Marathon County, with the development of the fur industry and the timber industry, that really led to ginseng production. A lot of ginseng production is credited with the Fromm brothers. So those are three brothers out of Hamburg, Wisconsin, who transplanted ginseng from the wild into cultivated in forest settings, really allowing you to expand production. Because in the wild, this plant only, grows a few feet apart. It doesn't grow at high density. And so they were trying to figure out ways to commercially grow this, which requires you to grow it at higher density. There were some earlier farmers in this area that they learned from, but they're credited with really expanding the industry, figuring out how to erect artificial shade structures using wood. Figuring out how to weed and pick the seeds and plant the seeds. They also had farmland, and so they were able to expand their production. And so they really dominated the industry from the early 1900s all the way up until about the 1980s. And you have to keep in mind, during some of this time, trade to China was shut off. During World War II, when Japan invaded China, a lot of southern China, Hong Kong, Guangzhou, where this product originally entered, the supply chain there, those ports were closed to trade. And what the Fromms did is they kept farming it and growing it because it's a multi-year crop, and they just stored it. And they stored it until after the war ended and then opened it back up for trade. And so ginseng has traditionally been traded in Hong Kong and southern China, Canton or Guangzhou, but it's also been an auction product, very similar to furs. And so these products came out of central Wisconsin, and transited the world. And a dried product like that takes 6 to 9 months, sometimes a year, to reach market. And so for 80, 90, 100 years, central Wisconsin has really led that production of ginseng up until probably about the 1990s, and when they started growing it in other parts of the world. But American ginseng, the Chinese consumer, especially the last 2 or 3 generations, have grown up knowing that the best ginseng in the world, or the best American ginseng, comes from central Wisconsin, in particular Marathon County.
Well, then why? Why Marathon County? And your website mentions the 45th parallel as something magic, and it goes right through north of Wausau, about 2 or 3 miles north of Wausau. Yep. Why?
So why the 45th parallel is that ginseng grows typically around the 45th parallel around the United States. Where it was discovered in Canada, where it naturally occurs in Asia and Korea, is all around the 45th parallel. Why Wisconsin in the 45th parallel, though, of all the places in the US or Canada, is because of the glacial soils that we have here. If you know the Ice Age Trail and where the glaciers receded, they deposited large amounts of minerals and really rich soils in this area around Marathon County. And so by depositing those trace minerals, it imparts a certain flavor. The French refer to it as terroir. And it has something to do with not just the climate of the 45th parallel, but the soil, the subsoil. There's very rich red granite coming out of this area as well. All those things impart little flavors. The other thing that comes from Marathon County is that history. Because we've cultivated it here for 100 years, there's a lot of techniques. Techniques in the harvesting, techniques in the washing, the drying, the curing of the product before it goes to market. All of these things impart flavor. No different than, I think, winemaking. Everything that you use from machines to hands makes a difference and changes the flavor of the product that you're consuming. So you have generations of consumers who grew up with the taste and flavor of Wisconsin ginseng coming from the soil, the weather patterns, the growing techniques, and they identify that taste and flavor. American ginseng grown in other parts of the world do not taste like ginseng grown here in central Wisconsin.
I mentioned to you before we started that I've spent a great deal of time in the last 20 years in a small village in southwest France, which incidentally happens to be 1 mile from the 45th parallel. So I say, why not near that village in France? Or why not in upstate New York? Or why not in Idaho? The 45th parallel goes through there as well.
There are other major growing regions, even here in North America, that border the 45th parallel. The weather patterns aren't the same. You go to the British Columbia area. There used to be a very large ginseng industry in British Columbia. That's a perfect example of an industry that went from zero to millions of pounds in a matter of years, and it's basically back to zero. The product that grows there doesn't taste like ginseng grown here. And so consumers who started buying British Columbia ginseng realized that while it looked like ginseng and maybe kind of tasted like ginseng, it didn't probably have the medicinal qualities that they associate with Wisconsin ginseng. Now, if you remember, in China, this is also, ginseng is treated as a medicinal root. And so it's food and medicine together. And so taste and flavor really matters to these consumers. And it does grow in upstate New York. There are some small commercial growers that are growing it throughout the kind of mid-Atlantic region and the Northeast. But the difference is the industry really has developed the technology given the long growing periods here. We also have access to large amounts of land that have that mineral and taste quality that people are looking for. The other major growing region nowadays is Ontario, Canada. It's at about 43 degrees north, very similar to Milwaukee. And the roots grow bigger there, and the taste and the flavor isn't the same. I go there quite often, and I try product from that area. And while it looks the same sometimes as Wisconsin ginseng, even when you cut the roots open and after they're dried, they don't look the same. And part of that has to do with the soil and the weather here. You just can't replicate it, even as close as Ontario.
Let's talk about the growing process. Ginseng is a 4 to 5 year a growing process, or has a 4 to 5 year growing process. Can you take us through the growing process and processing that you do over 4 or 5 years?
It's a very, very labor intensive crop. The seeds are picked by hand, and what happens with the seeds is when we talk about growing cycle, that doesn't count the seed germination and embryos. So you pick the seeds in the fall, and we plant them the following year. There's a stratification process for those seeds to get them to develop the embryo. So we bury those. Typically, they're buried in the ground. Historically, in the past, we put them in refrigerated coolers now to simulate the cold weather. We plant them normally in the summer or fall the following year. So it's already been 1 year since the seed has been picked. It's then planted. It doesn't germinate until the following spring. So if you harvested the seed in, say, 2017, planted it in 2018, you don't see the first leaves or stem from the plant until the spring of 2019. So it's been 18 months since the seed was picked before germination, and then the growing cycle typically is 3, 4, or 5 years after. The soonest you can harvest is 3 years. The roots tend to be a little bit smaller and the yield is not as good. A lot of farmers nowadays are shifting to 4-year production and 5-year production because you get better yields and the root sizes are larger and the demand for larger roots is increasing. Now, during that 3 to 5 year growing cycle, you have to do everything else. You have to maintain those shade structures. So those black shade cloth that you see if you drive through central Wisconsin, those shade structures get rolled up, get furled and unfurled every spring and every winter because they can't support the weight of snow. So we've moved from wood shade now to fabric shade. You have straw, and that straw mulch to keep weeds down. All of the gardens are weeded by hand. There is no Roundup Ready ginseng. So when we're spraying ginseng, we're spraying primarily to prevent fungal growth and funguses, the diseases that attack ginseng. But there's no herbicides sprayed on ginseng because ginseng is a broadleaf plant. You spray it, it will die. And so all those gardens are weeded by hand. All the seeds are picked by hand. Seeds typically show up after 3 or 4 years of growth. And so all those seeds are picked by hand. It's very, very labor intensive crop, which is part of the reason why we have the techniques here, but it also makes Wisconsin special because we've been able to develop those techniques to take care of the crop here.
And then the harvest?
So the harvest is also somewhat by hand. We use modified potato crack diggers, and also we now have mechanized harvesters, but a lot of those acres are also picked up by hand. So if you remember a potato digger, what happens is all the potatoes, or in this case ginseng, fall off the back of the digger back onto the ground. You have crews of labor that are literally following the machine and picking up those roots off the ground by hand. So even when you see us cruising, what we call cruising the product as it's being washed, we're pulling off, foreign material and bad roots, blemished roots off of the line. Those are all pulled off by hand as well. And we do that twice during that curing, cruising, drying period. So it takes not only years to grow, but then weeks and months after it's harvested until it's dried. So this is a low temp dry. It typically takes about 2 to 3 weeks to dry correctly. It takes 2 to 3 weeks of curing beforehand. So even roots that you harvest in September, October, a lot of times they don't come out of the dryer or the kiln until December, or in some cases even January. So this is not a process that you can speed up. It's not quite as maybe time consuming as aging, wines or spirits, but it definitely requires years of preparation.
What's the purpose of the shading you were talking about?
So the shade is to simulate the wood, the forest floor. It's because this is a forest plant, and so when the Froms transplanted the product or the plants from the wild into cultivated settings, they had to simulate that shade. And so having the timber industry here in central Wisconsin really kind of sped up that process of developing artificial shade because you needed wood posts and riders to support that wood lath structure. You'll still drive through central Wisconsin and see some farmers who use wood lath shade. That wood lath shade in the past had all been used, nails or staples nowadays, and strips of wood, so you needed milling.
Another unique thing about ginseng is that once you've used a parcel for this 5-year process, you can't reuse it again for ginseng growth.
Yeah, it's a different type of farming because we don't go back to the same land twice. The diseases that attack ginseng are specific to the ginseng species. They don't attack other crops, especially other things like that cash crops that we may grow here, corn, soybeans, etc. So the diseases that attack ginseng stay in the ground. And so when you go back and plant after one cycle of 4 or 5 years, those diseases come back rapidly. And so we don't go back because you don't get the yield and it doesn't make it economically viable.
Wisconsin produces about 1 million pounds of ginseng a year, worth about $50 million. Hsu Enterprises is the top ginseng company in the state. Tell us something about your operation. How many acres, your facilities, how many employees?
So we grow hundreds of acres here. We're probably the second largest grower in Wisconsin. We have over 100 employees. They are doing everything from farming to processing and packaging ginseng. All the roots, after they are dried, are hand trimmed. They're trimmed by hand, they're packaged by hand. It's very similar to kind of the older technology that you use to make clothing or handbags. So we do hand trimming, we do hand packaging because this product is given as a gift. It's a high value product. So every root gets touched by hand even after it's dried. And then we do all of our retail sales and fulfillment out of central Wisconsin, out of our headquarters just north of Wausau. And so on a daily basis, we're shipping hundreds of packages to consumers around the world, if not around the United States, who will then take this product back or give it as gifts when they go to visit family. And so it's a tradition of gift giving combined with wanting to promote good health amongst your parents, amongst your family members, amongst those you love. And so we have, my dad started the catalog business. So we have a Mandarin catalog that he started in the early 1970s, and we believe it may be the first Chinese catalog in the United States. And it gets mailed to millions of households that speak Chinese or Mandarin here in the US, and they come and buy products from us, and we ship those products right out of central Wisconsin.
You've recently signed an agreement with Foxconn, the tech giant that's going to be building a manufacturing plant in the Kenosha area. It was called a Strategic Cooperative Agreement to jointly develop Wisconsin's ginseng industry and grow Foxconn's newly established Wisconsin-based ginseng brand, Ginseng.
So this is really looking at the future of ginseng and how the industry is going to change. With all the hand packaging and hand processing, not just on the farming side and on the packaging side, But we're really talking about processing and the future. How can we make this process more efficient to pass on some of those savings to the consumer? But we also know the consumer is changing. Consumers nowadays want food that is convenient, ready to eat, ready to use. Ginseng requires you typically to rehydrate it or cook with it for a number of hours. Chinese consumers, as they change, won't have the time to wait overnight for things like ginseng tea or ginseng soup. So it's how do you make this product more convenient and ready to use or easy to use for the next generation of Chinese consumer. And so that's really what we're talking to Foxconn about and why we're cooperating with them. They want to source the best ginseng in the world. People know that that's coming out of central Wisconsin. So that was part of the agreement with the Ginseng Board of Wisconsin. The next portion of the agreement is how can we improve the technology around processing and packaging so that this product gets into consumer hands more efficiently, but also in ways where consumers can use it immediately. No one wants to wait for anything. And so having to wait hours or minutes for ginseng so that you can consume it doesn't make sense in today's world. And that may not be today, it might be 5 or 10 or 15 years from now, but it's no different than the development of convenient foods. And so if you think about a lot of products that you and I eat every day, those products originally were like ginseng. They were dried and stored and used over days, weeks, months. Nowadays, nobody wants to wait an hour for a cookie. So what do? We go and buy it in the store and we eat it and consume it immediately. And so as our business has developed, as I've come in, that's one area that I think we need to develop, not only as farmers, but as an industry, which is how can you make this easier for the customer to use so that they can use more of it?
Hsu Ginseng has got a place in the Chinese market. That marketplace knows Hsu Ginseng.
Yes.
Could this deal with Foxconn lead to rebranding Hsu Ginseng as Ginseng?
No, I don't think that's where we're going. I think what Ginseng is looking for is how they can partner with us. They already know that we have a great brand. They already know that Wisconsin has the best ginseng, regardless if Ginseng buys it from us or other farmers in this area. But you also have to think about the product in terms of marketing. How are you going to convince consumers that they're getting a quality product? It's one thing to make it convenient and easy to use. It's another thing for people to trust and understand that that brand has some understanding of what they're doing. And so Hsu's, because we have over 40 years in this industry, working with Ginseng, we give them some of that backing and understanding of how to make this product marketable to that next generation of Chinese consumer.
Could the deal with Foxconn lead to development of some of the land that Foxconn has outside of Kenosha for ginseng production?
We talked about that. I mean, ginseng can be grown as far south as the Milwaukee, Kenosha, Racine area, and it used to be. But I think given the land values, they're probably much more likely to make a lot more money making electronics than you will growing ginseng. So we're farmers. They know the technology. We'll kind of leave it at that.
Well, we've talked about China. Foxconn is a giant in the technology industry. We're suddenly talking about the world. What about ginseng's place in the world trade arena? In 2017, there was a lot of talk about trade wars and tariffs and that kind of thing, and China's involved.
Yes.
So I would imagine ginseng's involved. How does all this affect the talk about tariffs and a trade war? How does it affect the ginseng industry?
So we believe that ginseng was somewhat targeted by China as a way for them to retaliate with tariffs because it's an agricultural commodity, because a lot of the processing and packaging and customers for ginseng are in China. So they import a lot of Wisconsin-grown American ginseng. They placed a 15% retaliatory tariff on ginseng earlier this year, and then they're adding an additional 5% recently to make it a 20% on top of the tariff originally, which is about 8 or 9%. So you're now looking at a 30-some% increase. What's going on though is that the buyers are asking the farmer or the producer, in this case us and our fellow farmers, to take a price cut. That tariff gets paid to the Chinese government because they don't want to pass it on to the consumer. And so it puts pressure on both ends of the supply chain. They ask the farmer to take less, or they have to charge the consumer more to offset those tariffs. And so really it's just a tax on either the farmer or the consumer, and the government ends up collecting it. And that makes it a tough position as a grower and a producer because your costs aren't going down. Likewise, you also understand that it's hard to pass all of that tariff on to the customer. So how do you meet in the middle? Because that's what trade is, right? Trade is about both sides feeling like they got a good deal. And if one side doesn't get a good deal, whether the farmer feels like they're taking too much of a price cut or the consumer is paying too much for the product, the deal doesn't get done. And so when you're in the middle of a trade war, sometimes it feels like you're stuck because you don't want to take a price cut, but you also understand that if you pass all of it on to the consumer may not buy the product. They may choose to buy something else or buy ginseng grown in some other part of the world, which unfortunately is a detriment to central Wisconsin.
What does the future hold? We've talked here about ginseng being a 4 to 5 year product. We've talked about it needing special soil, and climate, and we've talked about the fact that the land once used for ginseng production can't be reused. It sounds almost like it's an industry that's destined to phase itself out. What does the future hold?
I think the future is bright for ginseng. As more and more medical uses are developed, but also as you figure out better ways to utilize the product using science, using technology, whether it be refining the product, further processing the product, extraction of the product. A lot of these things could lead to getting the same results or the same active ingredient without having to grow more. A good example might be leaves. We know that leaves have a lot of ginsenosides, or the active ingredient in ginseng. Right now, those leaves aren't used. And so it's how do you utilize some of these other parts and products. Ginseng has traditionally been used as the taproot. There's a lot of other parts of the plant, whether it be the prongs and the fiber or the tails of the root, that could be used to develop products that we've never really looked into. And so that part, combined with, how quickly technology is changing on the agriculture side, will probably solve a lot of the problems that we have, not just replanting, but also figuring out how to get the product into consumers' hands more cost effectively. And so if you can do that, I think that the future for ginseng and the next generation of farmer, the next generation of producer will be bright.
Number one in cheese, number one in cranberries, number one in ginseng right here in central Wisconsin and Marathon County. From the early 1900s to the 21st century, certainly an idea and a crop worthy of the green chair. Will Hsu, thank you for helping us tell the story of ginseng here in central Wisconsin. I'm John Lobbs for WisconsinEye. Thank you for joining us for this edition of Bright Ideas from the Green Chair, and look forward as we do for the next edition from the Green Chair.